The fluorescent lights of Lawson's grocery flickered above me, casting a pale, cold glow over the empty aisles. Outside, snow kept falling endlessly, clinging thick to the fogged windows and the silent walkway that hadn't seen a footprint for hours. The wall clock ticked with painful slowness, inching toward midnight, the final stretch of my second consecutive night shift. My fingers ached as I counted the last of the day's receipts, the rough paper edges leaving tiny cuts I wouldn't notice until later, when the sting of sanitizer would make them burn. The store was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, heavy and shallow. The heater had been broken for days and never fixed, leaving the checkout counter wrapped in icy air. I sat hunched behind the register, my hands tucked deep inside the sleeves of an old hoodie, worn thin around the wrists. My eyes burned from exhaustion and the harsh ceiling lights. I hadn't had a break. I couldn't even remember the last proper meal I'd eaten. Life had become a loop: work, pay bills, care for my mother, then work again. I had almost forgotten what rest felt like. Just as I was about to lock the door, the bell above the entrance chimed a sharp, unexpected sound that made me jerk my head up, and that's when I saw him. The man stepped out of the snow, moving with a calm, deliberate stride, as if the freezing air outside meant nothing to him. The light caught the charcoal wool of his coat, the dark polished buttons, the raised collar half hiding a strong, square jaw. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and a few droplets of melted snow slid down his shoulders as he passed the refrigerated aisle. I wasn't sure where my eyes lingered longer: on the black leather gloves with long, elegant fingers, or on the Italian shoes untouched by a single flake of snow. But what held me most were his eyes, deep, cold, unreadable. He didn't look like anyone who had ever walked into this store in the 3 years I'd worked here. He didn't glance around nervously like tired travelers stopping by. He didn't check his phone or pull out his wallet. He just looked around the store once, slowly, then fixed his gaze on me, as if he already knew exactly why he was here or for whom. I straightened instinctively, my hands clasping in front of me, a strange question echoing in my head. Who was this man, and what was he doing here at midnight, in a snowstorm, when no one else would dare be out? I forced a polite smile, though it probably looked stiff, my face numb from the long day. He didn't respond with words, only gave a brief nod. Then he walked to the self-serve coffee counter, poured himself a black coffee with no sugar, and came back to the register. I took the $100 bill from his gloved hand, my own trembling, not sure if from cold, exhaustion, or something else I couldn't name. His voice was low, smooth, almost a whisper. "Keep the change." I stared at the bill in my hand, then looked up to thank him, but he was already turning away, striding to the door. The bell rang again, and then he was gone, swallowed by the snow as suddenly as he'd appeared. I didn't know whether I shivered from the cold or from the faint premonition that this man, Dominic Moretti, would change everything in my life, beginning with that snowy night. Before we move on to part 2, if you're still here with me in this story, tell us where you're listening from, wherever you are in the world. Leave a comment below and let us know how Hannah's story and the mysterious man in the snow has touched you. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to hear more emotional and dramatic stories every day. Your support keeps us telling tales of fate, of encounters that seem accidental but might change a life, like the next chapter, when Dominic returns, and the bell of Lawson's grocery rings once more. I didn't think I'd ever see him again. The stranger Dominic Moretti had vanished into the white curtain of snow like a winter ghost, leaving behind only a still warm coffee cup and an odd, lingering unease that followed me through the rest of that night. I didn't tell anyone about him. I didn't keep the $100 bill as some romantic token. I used it to buy medicine for my mother, pay the electric bill, and fill the gas tank for my morning commute. It all seemed like a strange moment in a life already full of strange moments. But 3 nights later, as I was replacing the toilet paper in the staff room, the bell chimed again. I hadn't even stepped out before the small security screen behind the counter lit up with a familiar figure. The dark coat, the straight posture, the steady gaze fixed on the register as if he knew I'd be there. I walked out, heart beating a little too fast, forcing myself to look calm as I approached the counter. He poured another cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream, just like before. I waited for him to say something, but this time he stayed silent longer, his eyes pausing on my hands as I took the bill from him. "Your hands still tremble," he said, his voice even and quiet, like he was talking about the weather. I blushed faintly, unsure if from being noticed or from the pull in his tone, soft, but impossible to ignore. Anyone would. Working 2 shifts in a row, I replied. Dominic nodded, a brief flash of understanding in his eyes. I used to have days like that. I didn't believe someone like him dressed in fine clothes, wearing a Swiss watch had ever known hardship, but his eyes didn't look like they were lying. I didn't ask more. Yet he spoke again, slower, clearer this time. Working yourself to death to survive, not to live. I looked up at him, the words hitting me like a mirror held to my own weary life. I nodded quietly. Dominic picked up his coffee and left again, as if he hadn't come to talk, only to remind me he was still there. And then he came back again, on other nights. Not every night, but often enough that I began to wait for the sound of the bell without realizing it. He always came between 11:30 and midnight, when the store was at its emptiest. Sometimes he bought a bottle of water, sometimes a protein bar, sometimes he just stood by the cookie shelf as if choosing something for someone else. I began noticing the little things, how he never carried a phone, never checked messages, never seemed in a hurry. As if, for him, this store wasn't just a convenience stop, but a quiet refuge. A place he came to not because he had to, but because he wanted to. One night he asked my name. I hesitated for a moment before answering, not out of shyness, but because I knew that once he said my name, I would no longer be invisible. Hannah, I said, and when he repeated it slowly, softly, like a breath, I felt something stir inside me, something uncertain between fear and longing. I learned his name later, not because he told me, but because I checked the payment record through my manager. Moretti. I searched online, but nothing clear came up. No social media, no public company records, just a few vague articles about real estate and private investment firms in New York. Dominic Moretti, a name that floated through major deals like a shadow, never confirmed, never denied. I should have felt uneasy, but strangely, I only felt curious, and I found myself waiting for the sound of that bell, not fearing it. I knew it wasn't normal, but then again, nothing in my life ever really was. That night began like any other. Snow drifted quietly beyond the fogged glass, and I was checking the cookie display near the entrance. Dominic hadn't shown up for 3 nights in a row, and I kept telling myself it didn't matter. He didn't owe me a visit, let alone an explanation. Yet his absence left a strange void in the air, like a familiar song cut off mid-melody. I returned to the counter, tightening my scarf as a draft slipped through the door that never quite shut. The clock on the wall had just struck 11:45 when the door swung open and the bell rang, not with the calm reassurance it once carried. 3 men entered. The one in front was thin, his eyes glassy, the smell of beer clinging to every step he took. The other 2 snickered behind him, walking unsteadily, coats hanging open as if the cold didn't touch them. I knew at once they weren't customers. They hadn't come to shop. I clasped my hands beneath the counter, forcing myself to stay composed. "Good evening," I said softly, my voice steady but small. The man in front turned to look at me, his eyes dull and unfocused. "Hey there, sweetheart," he sneered, glancing around the store. "You here all alone?" My heart thudded. I gave a nervous smile. "We have cameras and an alarm system. If you need help finding something, I can assist." He moved closer to the counter, dragging a filthy fingernail across the glass. "All I need is a smile from you." The 2 behind him burst out laughing. One pulled a beer can from his coat pocket, popped it open, and drank right there. The tension in the air thickened, spreading through the quiet space like a storm gathering strength. I stepped back slightly, reaching under the counter toward the panic button. Before I could touch it, the man leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Who you think you're calling, huh?" I kept my tone calm. "If you're not here to buy anything, I'll have to ask you to leave." He chuckled darkly. "Or maybe you come over here and have a drink with us?" His hand brushed the counter's edge as if he might climb over. Fear locked my body in place. My hands shook, and I wasn't sure I could even breathe. And then came the sound of footsteps, slow, firm, deliberate. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Dominic. He entered like a gust of winter wind from the dark, his eyes sweeping across the room in a single motion, pausing on me before fixing coldly on the 3 men. Without a word, without so much as a greeting, Dominic strode forward, seized the thin man by the collar, and slammed him back against the shelves. The beer can hit the tile floor and burst open, liquid splattering everywhere. "Touch her again," Dominic said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I'll make sure you never touch anyone again." The other 2 froze, fear flashing in their eyes. The man in Dominic's grip gasped for air, his face reddening. "We were just kidding, man," one of them stammered. Dominic turned his head, his gaze sharp enough to cut through the air. "Then get out before I change my mind." They didn't need to be told twice. All three stumbled out, tripping over each other like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The door closed behind them, leaving a heavy silence. I stood motionless behind the counter, my breathing quick and uneven. Dominic turned to me, his expression softening. "You okay?" I nodded, though my throat felt locked tight. "They didn't hurt you?" I nodded again, mostly to keep the tears from spilling. Dominic stepped closer, not touching me, just standing there, solid and still, like a quiet wall between me and the world. "I got here too late," he murmured. I looked at him, unsure what to say, because a part of me, a very real part, had begun to feel safest when he was there, and another part, deeper and far more fragile, had started to fear not the drunken men, but the strange sense of peace I found in the eyes of a man I barely knew at all. After that night, Dominic began coming back more often. No warning, no pattern, he simply appeared, as if some invisible instinct told him when I needed him most. Sometimes it was at the end of my shift, when I was locking the fridge. Sometimes it was in the middle of the night, just as I finished wiping down the coffee counter. But every time was the same. The bell above the door chimed softly through the quiet, and he stepped in with that calm, deliberate presence no one else could imitate. I never asked why he returned, and he never explained. He just came sometimes without a word, buying a can of sparkling water or a small bag of cashews, leaving the money on the counter before standing beside me for a few silent minutes. Occasionally, he asked simple questions, never intrusive, never showy. "Have you eaten yet? Are you cold? How's your mother doing?" Questions that might sound ordinary to anyone else, but at that time, they were the only things that made me feel like I still mattered, as if I was more than just another cog turning through the same, exhausting cycle of survival. I started realizing that I waited for the sound of the bell more than I waited for the end of my shift. One night, he came when I'd fallen asleep behind the counter, too tired to keep my eyes open. Before I even looked up, a cup of hot ginger tea was placed gently in front of me. "I saw you nodding off on the camera outside," he said, his voice carrying a quiet hint of concern. I didn't know when he'd started watching over me from beyond the door. I wasn't sure whether to feel frightened or comforted, but the way he said it, the way he set down the cup without needing to explain, made it impossible to be angry. Once, I asked, "Why do you keep coming back?" "I'm just a night shift cashier, nothing special." Dominic looked at me for a long time, so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said softly, "You think I come here because you're not special?" I didn't know how to take those words, only that my heart seemed to slow its rhythm for a moment. No matter how hard I tried to keep my distance, to stay sensible, there was one truth I couldn't deny. Dominic wasn't like any man I'd ever met. There was something in him both dangerous and gentle, and it was that contradiction that made it impossible to look away when he appeared. One evening, he came without buying anything. He just stood at the far end of the counter, quietly watching me fold paper bags. I teased, "No coffee from me tonight?" He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I didn't come for the coffee." I looked up, ready with a reply, but he was already closer. "I came for you." I froze. Such simple words, brief and steady, yet heavier than any gift I'd ever received. I didn't answer. I didn't look away. I just stood there, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat pounding against my ribs, as if it were the first time I'd truly felt alive. From that night on, Dominic was no longer just the man who walked into the store at midnight. He became the second breath I took during those long, frozen nights. And I knew, even if I couldn't yet name what I felt, that his presence had become something I could no longer let go of easily. What I didn't know was that this quiet bond between us would draw me into a world I had never dared to enter, a world that belonged to him, a world where love and danger could trade places in the span of a single breath. I can't remember the exact moment the doubt began to take root. Maybe it was the night he told me he came for me, or maybe it was all those times he appeared at the very moment I needed him, as if he could sense what was about to happen before it did. Dominic wasn't like other people. He was too calm, too controlled, too private. The things he'd shared about himself were so few I could count them on one hand. I knew he had once worked in real estate, that he had an uncle named Vito, living in New Jersey, and that he hated rain even more than snow. but everything else was a blur, a half-closed door I was never meant to open. One night after work, I tried searching his name online. Dominic Moretti, a common enough name. But when I added New York or Buffalo, results began to appear that made my chest tighten. There was an old article from a few years ago about an unresolved investigation involving a money laundering network operating under the guise of real estate investment. Several names were mentioned, one of them Dominic Moretti, though no one was ever charged, and the case soon disappeared from the news. Another site listed individuals once monitored by the FBI for possible ties to Italian organized crime along the East Coast. Dominic's name was there too, no photo, no address, no trace, as if he were a ghost. I shut my laptop, my trembling hand pressing against my chest. I didn't want to believe it. I had no real proof, but my instincts, the same instincts sharpened by years of surviving on my own, were tapping anxiously against my ribs. I started paying closer attention. Each time Dominic came by, I watched how he moved, how his eyes scanned the room. He never turned his back to the door. He always seemed to know when someone was about to enter, even before the bell chimed. He paid only in cash. His phone never rang, never buzzed, not once when he was near me. Once, I caught a glimpse of a scar beneath his shirt cuff, a long, faded line along his wrist, pale but unmistakable. I didn't dare ask, but the questions kept piling up in my mind. What had he done before coming here? Why did he care about a nobody like me? Was he running from something or protecting me from something worse? I brought all of it to Lisa, my best friend, one rare afternoon off. She worked as an ER nurse, so few stories ever startled her. I told her everything from the night Dominic first walked in, to the 3 drunk men, and how he had handled them, her brow furrowed early on. When I mentioned the name Moretti, her eyes lit up with recognition. "I've heard that name," Lisa said, her voice dropping. "I think it's connected to something, underground. Nothing proven, but if it's the same person, Hannah, you need to be careful." I forced a small laugh. "I know, but he's never done anything to hurt me." I was no patience. Lisa stared at me for a long time, then sighed. "The dangerous ones don't always hurt you right away. Sometimes they make you feel safe, loved, seen, and when you finally depend on them completely, that's when they disappear, or drag you down with them." I sat there in silence, my thoughts tangled beyond repair. I wanted to believe Dominic was who I felt he was, kind, gentle, a man with a past trying to start over. But some part of me knew that if I didn't find out the truth soon, I might already be in too deep to ever climb back out. And in that moment, for the first time, I asked myself, if Dominic truly was the man I feared he might be, then why did I still find myself wishing he'd walk through that door every night? 3 days after my conversation with Lisa, I received a call from the hospital. The nurse's voice on the other end was polite, but her first sentence stole the air from my lungs. "Mrs. Evelyn Reed, my mother, had just had her remaining medical bills paid in full, nearly $40,000. The debt I had been chipping away at for almost 2 years, working 3 jobs and still barely covering half, was gone." I froze as the nurse confirmed that the payment came from an anonymous account. No name, no contact, just a short note attached. "Because she deserves to breathe easier." I set the phone down, suddenly too heavy to hold. For a moment, everything around me spun relief, confusion, and a surge of anger I couldn't quite name. I didn't have to ask who it was. No one else had reason to do this. No one but Dominic Moretti. He had crossed a line. I don't remember how long I waited, only that I found myself standing outside the store in the biting January wind, until his car finally pulled into the lot across the street. Dominic stepped out, calm and composed as always, but the moment he saw me, something in his eyes shifted. He knew. I didn't need to say a word, but I did, my voice sharper than I expected. "What gives you the right to do that? Do you think I can't take care of my own mother? Or do you just see me as some charity case you can save?" Dominic stayed silent for a long time before he spoke. His voice was low, deliberate, each word weighed carefully. "I didn't do it because you're not capable. I did it because you've been carrying too much, for too long, and no one's ever helped you. I just wanted you to know you don't have to fight alone." Those words spoken in another moment might have made me cry, but right then, I couldn't hear the kindness in his tone. All I heard was intrusion. He had stepped into my life in a way I hadn't allowed. No permission, no choice. I didn't need a savior. I needed respect. "You don't understand," I whispered, my throat raw. You think you can fix everything by throwing money at it? That you can buy my gratitude? Dominic took a step closer, his composure faltering for the first time. I don't want your gratitude. I just couldn't stand watching you fall apart another day. I stepped back, the space between us suddenly too small, the air too heavy. Then don't watch. Don't come back. It is intention of BP. For the first time, I saw something break in him, not much. Just a flicker of pain across the surface of the strength he always wore like armor. But I saw it. And somehow, it made me even angrier. Because a part of me wanted to go to him, to apologize, to let him hold me and tell me everything would be okay. But the other part, the one I'd fought so hard to protect all these years, wouldn't let me lean on anyone. Especially not him. Dominic nodded slowly, offering no defense, no final word. He turned and walked back to his car, leaving me standing there in the cold, wrapped in anger I couldn't untangle. I knew I'd overreacted. I knew he hadn't meant to hurt me, but in that moment, I couldn't bear another reminder of my own helplessness. His act of kindness had become a blade pressed against the pride I'd spent my whole life defending. I didn't show up for my shift the next night. I didn't answer my phone. I just sat alone in my room, staring at the ceiling, wondering why the people who wanted to help me always made me feel smaller. And why, in the middle of all that anger, the part that hurt the most wasn't that Dominic had crossed a line, but that he had done it with a heart that was trying to be good. 3 days after that tense confrontation, I went back to the store. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. The bills still arrived on time, the fridge was still empty, and my mother still needed her medicine every night. I didn't expect Dominic to show up again. Part of me was ashamed of what I'd said to him. Another part didn't know how I'd react if I saw him. Maybe I was more afraid of my own feelings than of his presence. The store looked the same as always, the flickering fluorescent lights, the cold linoleum floor, the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. But when the doorbell rang at 11:43, I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Dominic still wore the same charcoal coat, his leather shoes spotless, his gaze as deep as ever but gentler now. He didn't come straight to the counter. He lingered by the door for a few seconds, as if waiting for my permission to approach. I looked at him and gave a small nod. He walked forward, carrying nothing, no coffee, no snack, no pretense. He simply stood in front of me, silent for a long while. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice low and so honest it made my chest ache. Not because I helped, but because I didn't ask if you wanted me to. I lowered my head, unable to meet his eyes. Dominic took a deep breath before speaking again, his words deliberate, as if each one was being chosen with care. "I'm not used to apologizing. I'm not good at talking about myself either. But you deserve to know." I lifted my gaze. He looked at me for a long moment, then began to speak. "I was born in Brooklyn, into a family where the name Moretti meant power and fear. My father ran what the papers called high-risk business. My mother died when I was a kid. I grew up around midnight meetings, whispered phone calls, and people who never looked each other in the eye. I thought that was normal, until I was 16. He paused, his eyes darkening. That was the first time I saw someone killed over a deal that went wrong, right in front of me. No blood, no shouting, just one dry pop and then silence. Afterward, my father drove me home like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep for 3 months. I stood frozen, my heartbeat slowing. Dominic went on, as if stopping would mean he'd lose the courage to continue. When I turned 20, I tried to leave. I wanted an ordinary life. I studied finance, started my own firm, tried to build distance from all of it. But the name Moretti doesn't let you disappear so easily. There are debts you have to pay even when you never borrowed. There are enemies you inherit just by being born." His voice grew hoarse. "I lost my closest friend in a situation no one dares talk about anymore. After that, I stopped trying to run. I chose to stand still, to live quietly, on the edges. Not too close to anyone. Not letting anyone too close to me." He looked at me then, and the weight in his eyes felt like a confession. "Until the night I walked into that store and saw you. A girl working herself to the bone, still smiling, still kind, still holding on to a little softness in a world that's forgotten how to be gentle. You made me want to try again. Not to start over, but to actually live for once." I don't know when the tears started. There was nothing romantic about his words. No promises, no excuses. Just a man standing between two worlds, unsure which would claim him, yet willing to let someone see the part of him still capable of feeling. I stepped closer, and took his hand gently not to forgive. Not because I was ready for whatever would come next, but simply to let him know I'd heard him. And though I didn't understand everything, in that moment, I realized I wasn't afraid of him anymore. What I feared most was that if I turned away, he might never let anyone else see that honest, human part of himself again. After the night Dominic told me about his past, something between us shifted. It wasn't the start of a romance in any obvious sense, no rushed beginning, no sweet promises, no fairy tale words. It was the calm after the storm, the kind that comes when two people have finally lowered a part of their armor and allowed the other to glimpse the most fragile parts of themselves. Dominic no longer came every night, but whenever he did, he always brought something small and thoughtful, a cookie I liked, an old book I'd mentioned in passing, even an umbrella quietly left by the door on days when rain fell hard against the glass. He never asked for anything in return. He simply waited, patient and steady, the way he seemed to move through the world with a quiet certainty that never demanded attention. I began to realize I was looking forward to his presence more than ever before. One night, heavy snow blanketed the city, wrapping everything in a white stillness. I was closing the store when my phone rang. Dominic. His voice was low as always, but there was a trace of hesitation. He asked if I wanted to finish early. I laughed, saying that in weather like this, even the buses might have given up. He didn't argue, just told me to wait 10 minutes. 15 minutes later, his car pulled up outside. Dominic stepped out, wearing his thick coat, the passenger door already open. No words, no explanations. I didn't ask where he was taking me. I simply got in, feeling the warmth from the heater spread slowly through my hands. The city blurred past the fogged window as we drove in silence. When the car turned onto a quiet street in the Upper East Side, I finally asked where we were going. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he parked in front of a tall building, turned to me, and spoke softly, his eyes gentler than I'd ever seen them. He said he just wanted me to rest for one night, not to worry about rent, or waking up to another day of exhaustion. If I wasn't comfortable, he'd take me home in the morning, just one night. One night without alarms, without hospital bills, without fear of falling behind again. I don't know why I nodded. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was the way he looked at me. Or maybe it was that small, defiant part of me that wanted to believe I deserved one peaceful night. Dominic's apartment was on the top floor, spacious enough that footsteps echoed softly against the dark wood floors. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the snow-covered city. The space was minimalist, elegant, almost austere. Everything about it reflected him. Controlled, quiet, and not easily reached. He led me to a smaller room at the end of the hallway, the bed layered with soft blankets that smelled faintly of peppermint oil. He told me to rest. There were clean clothes in the closet and a new toothbrush by the sink. When I turned to thank him, he simply smiled and closed the door behind me, leaving me alone. That night, I slept deeper than I had in years. No dreams of hospital corridors, no memories of counting change at midnight, no jolting awake to the sound of sirens outside. When I woke the next morning, the kitchen smelled of coffee and warm pastries. Dominic sat at the counter, sleeves rolled up, reading the paper, somehow both distant and close at once. He didn't say much, only asked what I wanted for breakfast. I didn't answer. I just sat beside him, feeling for the first time that I belonged somewhere warm. And from that morning on, I didn't go back to my cramped room. Dominic never asked how long I planned to stay, and I never counted the days. We lived together quietly, no labels, no promises, just two people who had somehow found each other in a world full of loss. But even in that peace, I knew his past hadn't really left. One day, it would come knocking. And yet, in that moment, I chose to stay. I chose to believe in him, at least until the day he no longer wanted me to. The first days living with Dominic felt like stepping into another world, a silent dimension I hadn't known I could exist in. Everything inside the penthouse was in perfect order, so precise it seemed that even a deep breath might disturb the air. Dominic never set rules, yet his presence alone made me careful with every movement. He didn't control me or pry, but there was an invisible line drawn around him, one that even the closest moments couldn't erase. Every morning, he rose early, exercised in his private room, then moved on to black coffee, the newspaper, and speakerphone calls filled with fragmented words: project, transfer, security check. Some days he disappeared without warning, returning late with dark circles under his eyes and the smell of cigarette smoke clinging to his coat. But he never explained, and I never asked. I tried not to. I tried to live by his rhythm, cleaning quietly, cooking with whatever was in the fridge, never questioning how everything was always stocked and ready. But slowly, the silence between us stopped being a sanctuary and became a distance instead. One evening, I opened the wrong door while looking for tissues and accidentally walked into his office. The light came on, and what I saw wasn't the desk or computer I expected, but a wall of security screens, street corners, narrow alleys, and one camera showing the grocery store where I used to work. A chill crawled down my spine. I shut the door before Dominic returned, but I couldn't shake the unease all night. Then, small details I had ignored began to surface. The whispered phone calls after midnight, the unfamiliar names, the small wooden box in his drawer containing a neatly maintained weapon, the faint scars across his chest he had never mentioned. I didn't want to turn into someone suspicious, but I couldn't pretend to be blind either. Dominic was always gentle with me, but the world he lived in was anything but gentle. One afternoon, while buying bread at the bakery down the street, the shop owner pulled me aside, his voice low, almost pitying. "You're living with Dominic Moretti?" I nodded without thinking. His eyes darkened. "You're young, you don't understand. Be careful. Men like him, they don't love without leaving a mark." My heart pounded as I walked home, the words echoing louder with every step. That night, I asked Dominic. No hesitation, no anger, just truth. I looked at him and said, "Who are you, really?" He was silent for a long time. Then he closed his laptop and met my eyes. "I'm someone who chose the wrong path before I even understood what right and wrong meant. Someone who thought power could replace what was lost. Someone who's seen too much fall apart to believe he can hold on to anything. But I'm also the man who stopped running the day he met you." I said nothing. His answer was both confession and warning. Dominic didn't justify himself, didn't deny it either. He simply left the choice to me whether I could stay or not. For the first time, I saw him fragile. Not trembling, not afraid, but exposed like he was placing his entire life in my hands. But I had my own fear. I once believed love could save everything, that if you cared enough, you could bridge any difference. But I was beginning to understand. Loving someone doesn't always mean you can step into their world, especially when that world is built on shadows and debts that never sleep. Dominic and I were opposites. He was power, discipline, secrets that lived behind locked doors. I was softness, stumbling through life trying to hold onto a scrap of peace. Between us was a boundary so thin it felt almost gone. And the more it faded, the more dangerous it became. I began to wonder whether love would be enough to keep me there when every step closer to him felt like walking toward an edge I had never dared to look over before. I called Lisa after weeks of silence. She picked up after a single ring, her voice tinged with surprise and the kind of gentle reproach that only a true friend can manage. "I thought you'd fallen off the face of the earth," she said. I let out a faint laugh, unsure where to begin. We met at a small cafe in Brooklyn, a quiet place with a tucked-away corner booth where the world seemed to move slower. When I arrived, she had already ordered me a cappuccino. Her eyes lingered on my face longer than usual, as if trying to read what my words hadn't yet revealed. "You look different," she said finally, though I couldn't tell whether it was a compliment or a warning. She was right, I was different. Living with Dominic had changed me. Being part of his world, even on its edges, had reshaped something inside me. It was a world I didn't fully understand, but I felt its pull every day, a world unlike anything I had ever known. "I think I'm in love," I said, almost whispering. Lisa stirred her coffee slowly, the spoon clinking softly against porcelain. "Dominic Moretti," she repeated the name like it carried a bitter aftertaste. "What do you actually know about that man, Hannah?" I hesitated. "I know he's made mistakes. He didn't hide that from me, but he's trying to change." Lisa shook her head, a small, weary smile crossing her lips without reaching her eyes. "I worked a night shift last week in the ER. A man came in broken ribs, blunt trauma, internal bleeding. He wouldn't say who did it. But one of my colleagues used to handle patients from organized crime cases. She recognized him. He's a debt collector. Works for Moretti." My stomach tightened. "Are you sure?" Lisa nodded. "As sure as the sun rises in the east. And that's not all." I went through some old records, a disappearance from a few years back. A young businessman, involved in a joint real estate venture among 3 parties. The last person to see him alive was Dominic Moretti. Nothing was ever proven. No one dared to dig deeper. Every lead just vanished. I couldn't tell if I was breathing or holding my breath. My throat burned dry. Lisa reached across the table and took my hand. Her eyes were no longer those of a curious friend, they were the eyes of someone afraid for me. "Hannah, you've always been the kind of person who sees the good in everyone. But sometimes that's what blinds you. Dominic might be kind to you, gentle, generous, but that doesn't mean his past is gone. Men like him, they don't ever really leave the road they started on." I wanted to protest. I wanted to say that Dominic wasn't that man anymore, that he had told me about the scars, the losses, the guilt that had carved him hollow. But I couldn't deny one thing. He had never said he'd left that world behind completely. I still heard the midnight phone calls, still watched him vanish without warning, still saw the shadowed look in his eyes when he glanced past me toward the window, as if waiting for something inevitable to come. "I know you love him," Lisa said softly, her voice gentler now. "But love him with your eyes open. Don't let your love become the chain that pulls you into a darkness you can't climb out of." On the way home, her words echoed in my head like a slow, steady drumbeat. Love with your eyes open. But how do you keep your eyes open without breaking your heart when the man you love belongs to a world your reason tells you to run from? When I returned to the penthouse that night, Dominic was sitting on the balcony, a cigar unlit between his fingers, his gaze lost somewhere over the sleepless city. He didn't say a word when I came closer, only pulled out the chair beside him. I sat down. The cold wind brushed against my collar, but I didn't feel it. What I felt instead was the tightening in my chest, the weight of a question I couldn't silence. If his past came back for him, would I be brave enough to stay, or would I be the one to walk away? I began to notice a change in Dominic not long after that night on the balcony. He spoke less, slept even less, and his eyes lingered too often on the front door as if waiting for something, or someone, to appear. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night to find the bed beside me empty. I slipped out of the room, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, and followed the long hallway to his office, the same one I'd once accidentally opened. The door was unlocked. Dominic stood with his back to me, talking on the phone, his voice low and restrained, but heavy with tension that couldn't be hidden. "I've been out of this for a long time," he said. "I don't owe him anything anymore." A pause, then sharper, harder. "If Frankie wants a war, let him come. I'm not backing down again." My chest tightened. I slipped back into our room like a shadow, but sleep never came again that night. By morning, Dominic was up early, making coffee as if nothing had happened. I didn't ask, and he didn't explain. But from that moment on, I knew something was coming, something dark and inevitable, gathering strength beneath the calm. 3 days later, I saw him. At first, I thought he was just another man passing by the cafe across the street, but then he stopped. He stood there for a long time, smoking, watching our building. He didn't even pretend to hide. Broad shoulders under a worn leather jacket, graying hair, eyes cold enough to cut through glass. When his gaze met mine through the window, goosebumps prickled my skin. That night, Dominic came home later than usual. His coat smelled faintly of smoke, his face unreadable. "Who did you meet?" I asked quietly. He looked at me for a long time before answering, his voice flat. "Frankie." It was the first time I'd ever heard the name. But the way he said it told me everything, that this wasn't an old friend. "Who is he?" I whispered. Dominic sank into the chair, unfastened his watch, and set it on the table like it had become too heavy to wear. "He's the man who once called me brother," he said, his voice rough, "and the first who wanted me dead when I decided to walk away." End quote. He told me about Frankie the way someone might recount a nightmare that had haunted them for years. They'd been inseparable once, the perfect pair in the underworld. Dominic was the strategist, the mind. Frankie, the muscle, ruthless, fearless, unstoppable. When Dominic tried to leave, he did the one thing no one in their circle had ever done. He vanished without bloodshed, without a trace, without permission. Frankie saw that as betrayal, and now, after all these years, he was back not to bring Dominic home, but to erase the past with blood. "He's already killed 3 men who tried to get out," Dominic said, staring into the distance. His voice wasn't telling a story anymore, it was a verdict. "I don't think he'll spare me." I sat beside him, my hand gripping his, but I could feel that something inside Dominic had shifted. The man who used to make coffee every morning and clear the dinner table beside me was gone. In his place was someone colder, sharper, a version of him I'd only heard about, now stepping back into the world he once swore he'd left behind. "Hannah," he said, turning to me, his tone firm, controlled. "I want you to leave for a few days. I've arranged a place. You'll be safe." I shook my head immediately, but he didn't let me speak. I'm not joking. This isn't just about me anymore. If he finds out about you." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I understood, and I was terrified. But what scared me more was the quiet resolve in Dominic's voice, the sound of a man preparing for a war he already knew he might not return from. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to watch another person disappear from my life. Frankie was back, and the ghost of Dominic's past had finally come knocking. I left on a fog-heavy morning. Dominic was still asleep, or maybe he only pretended to be. The apartment was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat as I softly closed the bedroom door. I had packed the night before, taking only what I needed. There were no arguments, no tearful confrontations, just a handwritten note left on the kitchen counter, where he made coffee for me every morning. "You can't keep fighting because of me, and I can't be the weakness that brings you down. I'm not leaving because I stopped loving you. I'm leaving because this love isn't strong enough to save us both." I wrote those lines through tears, each word cutting into me like a small wound. But I knew if I didn't walk away now, there would come a day when Dominic would have nothing left to hold on to except guilt and blood. When the taxi rolled out of the Upper East Side, I looked back one last time. The building still stood tall, cold and silent, as if it had never witnessed the tenderness that once lived within its walls. I didn't know how Dominic would react when he read the letter, whether he'd call or let me vanish as though I'd never existed. But I knew that in the moment I stepped away, something inside me broke beyond repair. A few days later, Lisa found me in a small rented apartment in Queens. I didn't tell her much, just that things had gone too far. She didn't press. She just made me a warm meal and stayed late into the night, as if afraid I might crumble if left alone too long. As for Dominic, he didn't call. Not a message, not a single word. I pictured him reading the note, setting it down, then punching the wall. I imagined him walking into the bedroom and seeing the empty closet, passing through the kitchen without glancing at the spot where I used to stand, slicing fruit every morning. Dominic wasn't the kind of man to chase someone once they'd chosen to leave. He had lost too much already to believe everything could be held onto. But that didn't make my pain any easier. A week passed. I lived quietly, cutting myself off from any news about Dominic or about what might be unfolding between him and Frankie. But every night, I dreamed of him. Sometimes I saw him sitting alone in the dark, an unlit cigar between his fingers, staring at the door as if willing me to return. Sometimes I saw blood dark, slow, silent seeping from a wound on his chest I couldn't name, and I couldn't touch him. Couldn't stop it. I could only stand there, helpless and breaking. Lisa told me I had done the right thing. She said that sometimes love isn't about staying, it's about leaving before everything becomes a tragedy. But my heart disagreed. My heart kept whispering that I had abandoned a man who never asked to be saved, but who, for the first time, had dared to show me his brokenness, and I had turned away. Somewhere in that city, wrapped in the last chill of winter, Dominic still existed. Maybe he was planning, maybe he was fighting, or maybe he was simply waiting for something he knew would never return. But I believe, somehow, I left behind a crack that nothing could mend. And for the first time in his life, Dominic Moretti couldn't use power, or money, or silence to repair something that had truly been lost. I walked away, he shattered, and our love remained between us like an unfinished song neither of us was brave enough to write to the end. It had been nearly 2 weeks since I vanished from Dominic's world when it happened. That morning felt like any other ordinary, almost calm. I woke earlier than usual, brewed myself a cup of black coffee, and sat by the window of the small apartment I was renting in Queens. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual indifference. Cars, horns, people rushing toward somewhere that didn't include me or my grief. I told myself I'd call Lisa after breakfast, tell her I was doing better, that I was thinking about going back to work. But that call never happened. When I opened the door to pick up a package, a tall man wearing a black baseball cap was standing there. I barely had time to step back before he lunged, pressing a cloth soaked in something sharp and chemical against my face. The world blurred. My scream dissolved before it ever reached the air. When I woke, my head throbbed so violently I thought it might split open. My wrists were tied. I was on the floor of a small, dimly lit room. A single yellow bulb hung overhead, its light flickering weakly over cracked walls. There were no windows, no sound except the slow, relentless drip of a leaking faucet somewhere in the corner. The room smelled of mold and iron, cold enough to make my bones ache. I didn't know how long I'd been unconscious. My throat was dry, my hands numb from the ropes cutting into my skin. Then the door creaked open, A man stepped inside, and even though I had never seen him before, I knew instantly who he was. Frankie. He didn't need a weapon. The way he moved, the smug curve of his mouth, the gleam in his steel-gray eyes, everything about him radiated danger. He pulled a chair across the floor and sat down in front of me. From his coat pocket, he drew out a cigarette, lit it, and took a slow drag. "So you're the girl who made Dominic Moretti soft," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational, like he was discussing the weather. "I have to say, you're not what I expected." I didn't answer. I kept my eyes on him, trying not to let the fear show, though it was flooding through me, hot and fast. "He used to be an animal," Frankie went on, his eyes narrowing. "Cold, precise, untouchable. He didn't need anyone, didn't love anyone. Then you showed up and suddenly he starts playing the saint, turning down jobs, ignoring calls, exposing his weak spots. Do you know how sick that makes me?" He laughed, low and hoarse, then pulled a phone from his pocket. He pressed a few buttons and held the screen up. My stomach dropped. It was me bound. Under the same flickering yellow light, he was recording. "Hello, Dominic," Frankie said, his tone rising, theatrical. "I'm guessing you're watching this with that pathetic look men get when they realize love makes them stupid. Look at her, your fragile little weakness." He turned the camera toward me. I turned my face away. "This isn't a warning," he said. "It's a declaration of war. You have 48 hours to come find me, alone. No cops, no tricks. If you want to see her alive again, you know what to do. Then he ended the recording, stood, and walked out, leaving me in the suffocating silence that followed. I sat there, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't know when Dominic would see the video, or how he would react, but I knew one thing with terrifying certainty. Frankie wasn't bluffing. He didn't just want revenge. He wanted to destroy Dominic from the inside, to make him watch the person he loved become a pawn in the game he'd tried so hard to escape. I leaned my head back against the wall, closed my eyes, and tears came, unbidden. Not from fear of dying, but from the knowledge that Dominic would come for me. And this time, he might not come back. Dominic received the video close to midnight. He was alone in the apartment, the lights off, the music off, the kind of silence that made even the wind's breath against the windows sound like a warning. A half-finished glass of whiskey sat beside him, the ice long melted. When the phone buzzed, just once, he almost didn't reach for it. But the number on the screen was unfamiliar, no message, no name, and when the video started to play, he was already standing before he realized he'd moved. The world stopped. Hannah's face appeared under a flickering light, pale, terrified, yet trying still to hold herself together. Then came Frankie's voice, low and deliberate, every word slicing open the past Dominic had tried so hard to bury. In that moment, he wasn't the man who had walked away from the underworld, trying to build something resembling peace. He was once again Dominic Moretti, the name people whispered with fear and respect. He dialed an old number. The voice that answered was rough, the kind that never asked unnecessary questions. "I need Frankie's location," Dominic said. "Now." No explanations. None were needed. In that world, blood debts and loyalty spoke louder than reason. 30 minutes later, Dominic left his apartment. The cold air bit at his face, but he barely felt it. Inside his coat, heavy and familiar, was a gun he had sworn never to touch again. He didn't think about plans, or odds, or survival. There was only one purpose: bring Hannah home. The warehouse where she was held stood on the river's edge, a forgotten smuggler's depot that once served as a hub for men like him, before being abandoned to dust and silence. He came alone, just as Frankie demanded. No police, no allies, only the rage and fear pounding inside his chest. The night swallowed him whole. Broken windows, cracked concrete, rusted steel. Dominic moved like a shadow, each step precise, controlled. The guards never saw him coming. One by one, they fell swift, silent, the way he used to move when survival depended on it. No gunfire, no noise, just efficiency, honed by years of darkness. When he reached the final door, the one leaking a thin sliver of yellow light, his heartbeat thundered so loud he could feel it in his throat. He pushed it open. Frankie sat on a metal chair, back turned, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. Behind him, Hannah was tied to a wooden post, her eyes wide with horror as she saw Dominic step into the room. "I knew you'd come," Frankie said, not even looking up. His tone was calm, almost satisfied. "Love makes people stupid. I was. You don't know a damn thing about love," Dominic said, his gun leveled at Frankie's back. You only know how to own. And you, Frankie turned slowly, his smile thin, feral, only know how to run. But not this time, Dominic. This time you're out of exits. He reached for his weapon, but Dominic was faster. A single shot cracked through the air, short, final. Hannah screamed. Frankie fell to the floor, his fingers still curled around the gun he never fired. Dominic didn't look back. He was already moving, untying her ropes, his hands shaking. Hannah collapsed into his arms, her body trembling, her breath uneven. She couldn't speak, only clung to him as though letting go would mean disappearing. He held her close, burying his face in her hair, the smell of smoke and fear giving way to something achingly familiar. I'm sorry, he whispered. I never should have let you go. Hannah shook her head, tears cutting lines down her dirt-streaked cheeks. I came back, and I'm not leaving again. He helped her to her feet. Together, they stepped out into the gray dawn. The river shimmered faintly under the thin, new light. Mist curled around them like a promise that morning still existed, even after nights like this. But Dominic knew it wasn't over. Frankie was gone, yet his shadow stretched farther than any single man. The war he'd avoided for years had found him again. He had saved Hannah. But the price for that salvation was still waiting, and this time he couldn't fight it alone. Dominic thought it was over the moment the bullet struck Frankie's chest, the moment the man crumpled beneath the warehouse's dying light, blood seeping into cracked cement, like the past itself bleeding out. But he had underestimated the darkness he once helped build. Frankie didn't die. One of the surviving men from their old world dragged him away while Dominic carried Hannah out into the breaking dawn. No one called the police. No one said a word. Silence had always ruled stronger than any law. Dominic knew someday Frankie would come back not to win, but to finish what had been left undone. And that day came sooner than he expected. 3 weeks later, on a freezing winter afternoon, Dominic found a folded note shoved beneath his door. No threats, no signature, just one line, scrawled in blue ink. This time it's real. Same place. Come alone. He didn't need to ask who had sent it. Frankie was back, and this time, there would be no mind games, only an ending. Hannah didn't know. Dominic left her in the apartment, locked the door behind him, and wrote a brief letter on the kitchen table. He didn't say where he was going, only that if he didn't return within 24 hours, she should call Lisa. The warehouse was as cold as the river beside it, the air biting like rust and salt. The door moaned when he pushed it open, a hollow groan that sounded almost human. Frankie was waiting inside. He didn't bother to hide. He looked thinner, harder, his face drawn tight by fury that had long since rotted into something darker. I knew you'd come, he said, crushing a cigarette beneath his boot. Dominic didn't answer. The two men stood facing each other, the ghosts of brothers, bound by blood, betrayal, and a history that no longer had anywhere to live. You took everything from me, Frankie hissed. My shot, my crew, my name, the respect I bled for. You think you can walk away from this world and leave nothing behind? I didn't walk away, Dominic said quietly. I just stopped hurting people to prove I could survive. But you did hurt me, Frankie spat, stepping closer. You made me a shadow in the empire I built. He drew his gun but didn't raise it. He didn't want an ambush. He wanted a duel, man to man. Dominic pulled his own weapon, then tossed it aside. If you came to kill me, do it, Dominic said, his voice low but steady. But this isn't about power anymore. It's about the fact that you can't stand that I'm not like you. The air thickened between them, heavy as smoke. Then Frankie lunged. The first punch missed. The second didn't. Blood sprayed from Dominic's lip. He didn't fight back, not yet. He let Frankie strike again, let the years of rage spill out. But when the next blow came, Dominic blocked it, twisting Frankie's arm, shoving him backward. Their bodies collided, raw and brutal, fists and elbows and fury. It wasn't about dominance, it was about ghosts, about everything they'd lost and everything they'd destroyed. Dominic wasn't stronger, but he was clear-headed. He wasn't fighting to kill, he was fighting not to. Frankie, blinded by hatred, faltered. Dominic seized the opening, locking his arm, flipping him to the ground. In seconds, Dominic was on top of him, his knee pressing into Frankie's chest, his gun in hand. One pull of the trigger would end it all, but he didn't pull. He drew in a shaky breath, eyes dark with exhaustion and resolve. I'm not you, he said. Frankie thrashed beneath him, shouting through blood and fury. You think letting me live makes you better? I'll come back, Dominic. I'll never stop. Dominic rose slowly, blood running down his brow, his voice deep and steady as stone. No, you won't, because this time, I'm not hiding anymore. He stepped back, the phone in his hand blinked red, recording every word, every confession, every name. By the time the police arrived, the echoes of their fight were still clinging to the walls. Dominic handed them the evidence without hesitation. No bribes, no silence, no shadows left to crawl into. That night, when the sirens faded and the cold wind swept through the empty warehouse, Dominic Moretti finally walked out of his past. He wasn't the animal the world once feared. He was a man who had chosen to live, to forgive, and to love. When the police took Frankie away, Dominic didn't turn to watch. He stood in the fractured darkness of the old warehouse, his eyes following the distant flash of red and blue lights as they carried away what was left of the man he used to be. A light rain began to fall, soft, hesitant, like the final tears shed by a dream that had never fully healed. He didn't feel victorious. There was no relief, no sense of justice served, only a hollow ache spreading through his chest, the weight of exhaustion built up over years of running, hiding, and surviving. He knew that if he had pulled the trigger that night, everything would have ended faster. But blood always calls for more blood, and Hannah would never again look at him as the kind of man she could love without fear. For the first time in years, Dominic chose forgiveness. Not because Frankie deserved it, but because he did. Because after all the wreckage, the only way out of the darkness was to stop feeding it. He couldn't erase the past, but he could decide it would no longer decide who he became. By morning, Dominic returned to the apartment. Hannah sat at the kitchen table, hands cupped around a cold mug of tea, her eyes swollen from crying. She had read the letter he left and spent the entire night caught between dread and hope, not knowing if the man she loved would ever come back. When he stepped through the door, the air between them froze. Dominic stood there, coat damp with river wind, bruises purpling his face, his gaze fixed on her as if he couldn't quite believe she was still there, bathed in morning light. Hannah didn't ask a single question. She just rose and crossed the room, wrapping her arms around him in a wordless embrace. Dominic leaned his forehead against her shoulder, his breath heavy and uneven, as though he were finally exhaling years of silence. "I didn't do it," he whispered. "I let him live." She didn't speak right away. She only tightened her arms around him, as though stitching back together all the unseen tears in his heart. "Because you're the man I believe in," she said softly. "And now you've proven I was right." In the days that followed, Dominic reached out to an old contact in the police department. He turned over every file, every ledger, every truth he'd once buried: names, roots, accounts, the blueprints of a world built on fear. He knew the cost of this choice could be his freedom, but he couldn't let Hannah build a life beside a man who still flinched at every shadow. He confessed everything except the names of those who had helped him disappear years before. The police didn't arrest him, not yet. They opened an investigation, aware that what he brought them could unravel a network that had survived for decades. Dominic didn't run. He wasn't afraid of prison. The only thing he feared now was losing the reason he'd chosen to change. And that reason, from beginning to end, was Hannah. The final battle was over. Dominic was no longer a fugitive, no longer a ghost. He was a man with mistakes, yes, but also a man who had chosen to face them, who had chosen mercy over vengeance, light over shadow. Forgiveness hadn't made him weaker, it had made him free. And for the first time in a very long time, Dominic Moretti finally understood what it meant to be alive. The little bakery on the corner of Brooklyn wasn't anything remarkable, yet each morning, when sunlight poured through the wide glass window and mixed with the scent of butter, vanilla, and sugar, it felt like the world outside paused for a moment long enough to taste something warm and gentle, like peace itself. Hannah unlocked the door on a March morning, when the last patches of snow had melted, and the trees outside were just beginning to bud hope, fragile but real, blooming right alongside them. There was no grand opening, no ribbon cutting, no glossy signs. Only a wooden board by the door, handwritten in soft cursive. Homemade pastries every day, a new sweetness. She didn't need a crowd. She just needed a beginning, quiet, kind, and hers. The kitchen behind the shop became her sanctuary. It was where healing took shape in the rhythm of her hands, the kneading of dough, the hum of the oven, the soft swirl of buttercream over freshly baked cupcakes. The same hands that once trembled with fear now moved with a steady grace. The same heart that once waited in darkness now beat to the comforting tempo of flour, sugar, and forgiveness. Her first customer was an elderly woman from upstairs, drawn down by the smell of baking each morning. She bought a single slice of banana bread and returned the next day for 2 more this time, with tea. Then came the bookseller from next door, a young couple, a little schoolgirl who stopped each morning just to inhale the aroma before running off, grinning. None of them knew who Hannah used to be. They didn't know about the abduction, the nights spent in fear, or the man who had crossed a city of ghosts to save her. And they didn't recognize the tall figure who sometimes stood quietly in the corner, a man in a dark coat, calm, unreadable eyes following her with the gentleness of someone still learning what peace feels like. That man was Dominic Moretti, once a name that made the underworld whisper. Now, just another face in a small Brooklyn cafe. Dominic never sought attention. He came for one reason only: a black coffee and a slice of apple pie. Hannah's recipe, the one she never put on display, the one she made only for him. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. When their eyes met across the room, the silence between them said everything. It said, "We're still here." It said, "This is enough." Dominic didn't know what the future held. His past still lingered in courtrooms and sealed files. One day, justice might come knocking, and he would answer. But for now, he wasn't hiding anymore. Hannah never asked about the late-night calls or the times he left quietly after dark. She trusted him not blindly, but with the calm faith of someone who had already lost too much to live in fear. She knew he would speak when he was ready. Until then, she kept baking. She slipped little handwritten notes into paper bags with each order. "Have a gentle day. Today is a chance to begin again. You are stronger than you think." Most people assumed those words were for them, but Hannah knew better. They were for herself, and sometimes for Dominic. Because she understood that new lives don't begin with grand gestures or perfect promises. They begin quietly with small, steady acts of grace, with the smell of bread in the morning, with a cup of black coffee, with the gaze of the man watching her through the glass in a light so clear and warm that even the shadows no longer dared to enter. That afternoon, the rain came softly, tracing silver threads down the bakery's window pane, as though it wanted to keep the last light of day from slipping away too soon. Dominic sat at his usual table inside Hannah's shop, the same black coffee, the same slice of warm apple pie waiting for him. But there was something different in his eyes, something quieter, heavier. Hannah noticed it the moment he walked in. He still smiled, still greeted her with that gentle nod that had become their wordless ritual over the past months. Yet behind that smile lay a decision he knew would change everything. When the last customer had gone and the shop had fallen silent except for the hum of the ovens, Dominic stepped into the back kitchen where Hannah was wiping down the counters. He hesitated, then said her name softly. She turned, her gaze calm but questioning. He didn't circle around the truth. He reached for her hand, firm, steady, the kind of grasp that said, "If I don't say this now, I never will." "I've contacted the FBI," he said, his voice lower than usual, rough at the edges. "I'm going to cooperate with them." Hannah didn't flinch. Her hand stayed in his. Her voice was even. "For what?" she asked, though she already knew. "To end it," Dominic said after a long pause. "Completely. Not just with Frankie, not just with the past, with everything. I'm giving them the list transactions, names, witnesses, routes, all the legal loopholes the organization used for years. I didn't keep them to blackmail anyone. I kept them because I knew this day would come. And that day is now." Hannah squeezed his hand tighter, not to stop him, but to let him know she wasn't breaking, even as her heart screamed in silence. "Will they arrest you?" she finally asked. "Maybe not," Dominic replied. "If I give them enough, if I testify, it's part of the deal, a trade for freedom. But not the kind of freedom that hides in the dark. Real freedom, the kind where I can live honestly." He paused, his eyes softening. "With you." Hannah pulled him into her arms. He held her close, his head resting against her shoulder, his heartbeat steady beneath the weight of all he had carried. He didn't need her permission, only her presence. In the days that followed, Dominic began meeting with federal agents. The sessions were long and draining hours of questions, documents, recordings, maps. He recalled every name, every number, every whispered deal he thought time had buried. The agents were stunned by his memory, and even more so when he asked for no protection, no plea bargain, no immunity. "I'm not here to bargain," he said in their final meeting. I'm here to end it. 3 weeks later, the FBI confirmed that nearly everything Dominic provided matched long-dormant cases. The myths, the rumors, the unprovable ties all suddenly had evidence. Dominic wasn't just a source, he was the missing piece, the living witness, and that changed everything. One evening, while Hannah was closing up the shop, Dominic returned earlier than usual. His eyes carried a light she hadn't seen in months. "They agreed," he said, his voice almost breaking. "They'll let me walk free, as long as I keep working with them until the case is closed." Hannah didn't answer. She stepped forward, took his hand, and pressed it against her cheek. Dominic leaned in and kissed her forehead, then pulled her into his arms. The rain outside hadn't stopped, but the room felt warmer, filled with something fragile, human, and alive. Dominic had chosen the hardest path, not to run, not to fight, but to face everything he once feared. And for the first time in years, he opened the door himself, not for the darkness to enter, but for the light to finally find him. That morning in Brooklyn felt like an unspoken melody. Sunlight streamed through the bakery window, glazing the freshly baked pastries in a golden sheen like warm honey. Hannah was smiling as she wiped the counter, her fingers still dusted with flour. When Dominic walked in holding 2 cups of steaming coffee, they didn't need words, just a glance, a quiet nod, and in that fleeting moment, the world seemed to pause. All the storms, the losses, the scars that once made them believe they might never heal, had led them here to this simple peace they had built with their own hands. Not through luck, but through courage, forgiveness, and the quiet conviction that everyone deserves a chance to begin again. Dominic was no hero, and Hannah was no princess waiting to be saved. They were 2 imperfect souls, scarred and human, who had once walked alone through the darkest corners of their lives, only to find each other when they needed it most. They weren't brought together by fate, they chose to believe in each other, even when the world warned them not to. And from the ashes of what once seemed impossible, they built a home, not grand, not flawless, but honest, and enough. That's when you realize something. Happiness is never given, it's made. It doesn't come from grand victories or perfect moments. It's born from quiet mornings spent unlocking the shop together, from a slice of sweet pastry shared after a long day, from waiting in silence without needing promises. It's born from the courage to say, "I'm sorry," from letting go of what once hurt, and from opening your heart to what's here, right now. The story of Dominic and Hannah isn't just a love story. It's a reminder that no matter who you are, no matter how lost, hurt, or broken you've been, there's always a way back to the light, if you dare to believe and dare to start again. And what about you? Have you ever faced a moment that almost broke you? What helped you keep going? We'd love to hear your story. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Every reflection, every emotion, every word from your heart becomes a small but precious part of the tapestry of human experience we're creating together. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who might need a little light today. By doing so, you help us spread hope and perhaps help someone else find the strength to begin again. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We wish you good health, a joyful heart, and peaceful days filled with kindness, abundance, and love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next story.